The judge banged his wooden gavel and looked me dead in the eye. He ordered me to remove my Navy cross. He said my military medal was an intimidation tactic and had no place in his civil courtroom. My sister-in-law smirked from the plaintiffs' table. My parents shook their heads in embarrassment like I was a misbehaving child. The entire courtroom fell silent, waiting for me to break. I did not yell. I did not cry. I calmly unpinned the highest honor of my life and placed it on the defense table. Then I reached into my jacket and pulled out my federal badge. I watched the blood drain from the judge's face as my next move ended his entire career. Before I share how I brought down a corrupt judge and my toxic family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you love seeing arrogant people get exactly what they deserve. The smell of hickory smoke and roasted corn usually brought me peace, but today the air felt suffocating. It was the first annual family cookout honoring my late grandfather, and we were hosting it on the very land he left behind. The Thorne estate was 50 acres of pristine lakefront property in Georgia. My grandfather worked 3 jobs as a mechanic and a groundskeeper to buy this dirt back when people who looked like us were not supposed to own prime real estate. He poured his blood and sweat into this soil. Now my family treated it like a bank account waiting to be drained. I stood by the massive oak tree near the water, watching my husband David play catch with our young nephews. David was a pediatric trauma surgeon. He was calm and steady, and he was my absolute rock. He knew how much this land meant to me. He also knew how much I dreaded family gatherings. My family had a talent for making me feel like an outsider in my own home. I was 34 years old. I had served as a Navy medic and intelligence operative. I had pulled wounded teammates out of burning vehicles under heavy enemy fire. Yet in the eyes of my parents, I was just the difficult daughter who refused to wear dresses and act like a proper lady. My older brother Isaiah was the golden child. He was 38 years old with a business degree from a prestigious university, but he had absolutely nothing to show for it. He had bankrupted a restaurant and ruined a tech startup. But my parents always bailed him out. They worshipped the ground he walked on simply because he was the eldest son. 3 years ago, Isaiah married Brittany Caldwell. Brittany was a white woman from a very wealthy real estate family. Her father essentially owned local politicians. Brittany looked down her nose at our family, but she loved the social clout of having a diverse husband she could parade around at country club dinners. The screen door of the main house slammed open. Brittany marched down the wooden steps. She wore a designer sundress and oversized sunglasses, looking completely out of place at a family barbecue. She did not bring a dish. She never did. Instead, she carried a thick manila folder. Isaiah trailed right behind her, looking at the ground like a lost puppy. I tightened my grip on my iced tea. I knew exactly what was coming. They had been dropping hints for months. Brittany walked straight past the food tables, ignoring my aunts and cousins. She marched right up to me and slammed the heavy folder down onto the wooden picnic table. The loud smack made several family members turn their heads. "Sign the transfer papers, Tamara," Brittany said. Her voice was loud and entirely too confident. "We have wasted enough time waiting for you to come to your senses." I looked down at the folder and then up at her. "Excuse me," I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Do not play dumb with me." Brittany crossed her arms. "My father has developers ready to break ground next month. This land is perfect for the new luxury resort and golf course. Isaiah is going to be listed as a co-founder on the project. He needs this land to secure his equity. You are just holding him back." I looked past her to my brother. Isaiah could not even meet my eyes. He shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Come on, Tamara," Isaiah mumbled. "You do not even use all this space. It is just sitting here growing weeds. This resort is going to make us millions. My father-in-law promised me a seat on the board. I need this win." I felt a familiar knot of anger tightening in my chest. "You mean you need a handout?" I replied calmly. "Grandpa left this land to me. He specifically put my name on the deed because he knew you would sell it to the first rich person who smiled at you. He wanted this estate to stay in the Thorne family. He wanted it preserved." Brittany scoffed loudly. "Preserved for what? You and David do not even have kids yet. What are you preserving it for? The squirrels. You are just being selfish and petty because you have always been jealous of your brother. I took a deep breath. David noticed the commotion and walked over, placing a supportive hand on my lower back. He did not intervene because he knew I fought my own battles, but his presence was a silent warning to them. Before I could tell Brittany to get off my property, my parents walked over. Julian and Brenda Thorne always traveled as a unit when it came to defending their golden child. My mother pushed her way to the front. She wore her Sunday best, clearly trying to impress Brittany. "Tamara, stop making a scene." My mother scolded me. I felt a sharp sting of betrayal. She had not even asked what the argument was about. She immediately assumed I was the problem. "I am not making a scene, Mom," I said softly. Brittany just slammed legal documents on the table and demanded I give away my inheritance. "Well, maybe you should listen to her," my mother said dismissively. I stared at her in absolute shock. I could not believe the words coming out of her mouth. She pointed a finger at me. "You have your military pension. You have a government job. You have David bringing in a doctor's salary. You have more than enough. Isaiah is struggling. He has debts to pay. He needs this project to stand on his own 2 feet and be a man." I looked at my father, hoping for a voice of reason. "Dad, are you hearing this?" I asked. "Grandpa worked his entire life for this land. You want me to hand it over so Brittany's father can bulldoze it and build a golf course for his rich friends?" My father sighed and shook his head, looking at me with pure disappointment. "Do not be dramatic, Tamara. Your sister-in-law is offering a business opportunity. Family helps family. You have always been so stubborn and combative. It is why you struggle to fit in. You need to learn how to compromise. Sign the papers and let your brother have his moment." The sheer audacity of their demands left me breathless. They were standing on the very soil my grandfather bled for, demanding I surrender it to a woman who openly disrespected our heritage. They were willing to sacrifice my rights, my legacy, and my grandfather's dying wishes just to appease their incompetent son and his wealthy wife. I looked around the yard. A few aunts and uncles were watching, but no one stepped forward to defend me. They never did. My parents ruled the family dynamic through guilt and manipulation. Everyone was too afraid of being cut out of the social circle to speak the truth. I was completely alone, except for David. "You think I am being stubborn?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think I am holding him back? Let us talk about the truth." 5 years ago, Isaiah asked Grandpa to mortgage this exact piece of land to fund his failed cryptocurrency business. Grandpa said no. Grandpa knew Isaiah was financially reckless. That is why he left the estate to me. He knew I understood the meaning of service and preservation. Isaiah turned red with embarrassment. "You always bring up the past to make me look bad," he yelled. "You think you are so much better than me just because you went to war. You just want to see me fail so you can feel superior." "No, Isaiah," I replied coldly. "I do not have to do anything to see you fail. You manage that perfectly well on your own." Brittany stepped forward aggressively, invading my personal space. "Listen to me, you ungrateful veteran." She spat the word veteran like it was a disease. "My father is not someone you want to mess with. He practically owns the zoning board and the city council. We brought these transfer papers as a courtesy. If you do not sign them today, we will take this to court. We will sue you for manipulating an old man with dementia into changing his will. We will drag your name through the mud." David tightened his grip on my waist. I could feel his anger radiating through his hand. He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand to stop him. This was my fight. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the picnic table. I thought about the sweat on my grandfather's brow. I thought about the bullets flying past my head in the desert and the sacrifices I made to wear the uniform of my country. I thought about the sheer disrespect of my parents demanding I surrender my dignity to satisfy their social climbing ambitions. I reached out and picked up the manila folder. My mother smiled, looking relieved. "There you go, Tamara," she said softly. "Just be the bigger person. Do what is right for the family." I did not say a word. I gripped the thick stack of papers with both hands. With one swift and powerful motion, I tore the entire stack straight down the middle. The sound of ripping paper echoed loudly across the silent yard. Brittany gasped, taking a step back in shock. Isaiah let out a pathetic sound of disbelief. My mother clutched her pearls, her mouth hanging wide open. I dropped the torn halves of the legal documents directly into the trash can next to the picnic table. I am doing what is right for the family, I said, my voice echoing with icy, absolute authority. I am protecting it from parasites. Brittany's face contorted with pure rage. You stupid, arrogant woman! She screamed, pointing a manicured finger in my face. You think you can humiliate me. You think you can reject my family. I am going to destroy you. I will have my father call Judge Atwood tomorrow morning. We will freeze your assets. We will claim you are mentally unfit. We will take every single blade of grass on this property, and we will leave you with absolutely nothing. I stared her down, refusing to blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The quietest voice in the room is often the most dangerous. You can bring your lawyers, Brittany, I said smoothly. You can bring your corrupt judges and your father's dirty money. But let me make one thing crystal clear to all of you. I shifted my gaze to look directly at my parents. They flinched under my stare. When you come for my land, you better come ready for a war. I have faced down actual terrorists and armed insurgents. Do you really think a spoiled real estate heiress and a lazy brother terrify me? This estate is not for sale. It will never be for sale. And if you ever show up on my property demanding my inheritance again, I will have you arrested for trespassing. My father stepped forward, his face purple with anger. You are a disgrace to this family, Tamara, he shouted. You are dead to us. Do not ever call us again. I smiled, a slow, cold smile that made my mother shiver. Do not worry, Dad, I replied. I have no intention of calling people who act like vultures. Now get off my property, all of you. Brittany grabbed Isaiah's arm and stormed toward her luxury vehicle. My parents followed close behind them, throwing disgusted looks over their shoulders. I stood my ground, watching their cars speed down the gravel driveway, kicking up dust as they fled. David pulled me into a tight embrace, burying his face in my neck. You handled that perfectly, he whispered. But you know they are going to play dirty, right? I rested my head against his chest, feeling the adrenaline slowly fade into a cold, sharp focus. I know they will, I replied, staring at the torn papers in the trash can. But they have no idea who they just declared war on. They thought I was just a retired medic. They thought I was just a stubborn daughter they could bully into submission. They did not know about my federal credentials. They did not know I tracked financial crimes for a living. They were about to learn that taking on Tamara Thorne was the biggest mistake they would ever make. The dust from their luxury cars had barely settled before Brittany made her first move. I knew she would play dirty, but I underestimated just how low she was willing to stoop to get what she wanted. By Tuesday morning, my phone was flooded with messages from extended family members and old high school friends. Brittany had taken to social media and local community groups, painting herself as a concerned family member trying to save our legacy from a dangerous, unstable veteran. The posts were crafted with terrifying precision. She claimed my time in the military had left me with severe violent PTSD. She wrote that I was unpredictable and prone to aggressive outbursts, making me a danger to my own family. The rumor mill in our community caught fire immediately. People who had known me since I was a child were suddenly whispering about how the war must have broken my mind. They whispered that the decision of my grandfather to leave me the estate was not an act of love, but the result of coercion. Brittany spread the lie that I had manipulated a dying old man, threatening him into signing the deed over to me while he was not in his right mind. The sheer cruelty of it took my breath away. My grandfather was sharp as a tack until the day his heart simply stopped. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it to protect our heritage from people exactly like Brittany. But truth rarely matters to people hungry for gossip. The community swallowed the lies whole because it was easier to believe the angry black veteran stereotype than to accept that a wealthy white heiress was trying to steal our family land. The ultimate insult arrived on Thursday afternoon when a process server knocked on our door. He handed me a thick manila envelope. Brittany had officially filed a civil lawsuit to contest the deed. The legal documents read like a character assassination. They officially petitioned the court to invalidate the property transfer, citing my alleged mental instability and claiming I had exercised undue influence over a vulnerable senior citizen. The lawsuit requested that the estate be immediately transferred to Isaiah as the rightful eldest heir. They were not just coming for my land, they were trying to destroy my reputation, my military service, and my sanity. When they realized I was not going to break down and beg for mercy, they decided to attack the one person who stood beside me. My parents. Julian and Brenda marched into the pediatric clinic where David worked right in the middle of his afternoon shift. David later told me they bypassed the receptionist and walked straight into his private office while he was reviewing patient charts. My mother started immediately putting on her best performance of a distressed parent. She told David that my behavior was tearing the family apart and that he needed to step in and fix it. She had the nerve to look my husband in the eye and tell him that he needed to control his wife before I embarrassed everyone further. My father chimed in, telling David that a good husband would not let his wife alienate her family over a piece of useless land. They assumed David would side with them to keep the peace. They assumed his calm demeanor meant he was a pushover. They were dead wrong. David did not raise his voice, but his words cut deeper than any shout ever could. He stood up from his desk and looked my parents up and down with absolute disgust. He told them that their daughter had pulled wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles under heavy enemy fire. He said that I had saved lives while they were busy worrying about their country club status. He walked around his desk and opened the door for them. His voice was cold as ice when he delivered his final warning. He told them that Tamara does not need to be controlled, and she certainly does not need to be controlled by people who are actively helping outsiders steal from their own flesh and blood. He banned them from his clinic and told them never to disrespect his wife in his presence again. My parents left the clinic humiliated and furious, but their retreat was only temporary. They thought they had the ultimate trump card playing behind the scenes. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the court summons Brittany had filed. I read through the legal jargon and the baseless accusations of mental incompetence. Then I flipped to the final page to see which judge had been assigned to the case. The name printed at the bottom of the document made my blood run cold for a fraction of a second before a deep, calculating calm washed over me. The presiding judge was Harrison Atwood. I knew that name. Anyone who paid attention to local politics knew that name. Judge Atwood was notorious in the legal community for his heavily biased rulings in real estate disputes. More importantly, he was a known associate of the father of Brittany. They played golf at the same exclusive country club and attended the same private political fundraisers. The wealthy real estate developer had practically bankrolled the last re-election campaign for Atwood through dark money political action committees. The assignment of this specific judge to my case was no coincidence. It was a targeted strategic move. The Caldwell family had pulled strings to ensure the lawsuit landed on the desk of a judge they already owned. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text message from my brother Isaiah. The message was short and dripping with arrogance. He told me to check the name of the judge on the summons. He bragged that Judge Atwood was a close personal friend of his father-in-law. He said I was completely cornered, and that if I just surrendered the land now, they might let me keep my pension. He told me I had zero chance of winning against a judge who was already in their pocket. Isaiah and Brittany were gloating. My parents were probably celebrating their incoming wealth. They all thought this was a simple open and shut case. They thought I was just a regular citizen about to be crushed by the weight of a corrupt local court system. They thought I would be terrified by the name Harrison Atwood. They did not know that I already had my laptop open, logging into a secure federal database. They did not know that I had spent the last 7 years untangling financial webs far more complex than a small-town judge taking bribes from a real estate developer. They thought they had me trapped in their little local courtroom, but they had just handed a federal investigator the exact thread she needed to unravel their entire criminal enterprise. Monday morning arrived, and I did not call a local attorney. I did not cry to my husband, and I certainly did not reply to the taunting messages flooding my phone from my family. Instead, I put on a dark, tailored suit, pinned my identification to my collar, and drove downtown. The drive was quiet, the streets of the city blurring past my window as my mind shifted from the personal betrayal of my parents to the cold, analytical focus of my profession. My family thought I was just a retired medic clinging to a government desk job to make ends meet. They pictured me pushing papers in a cubicle somewhere, filing administrative reports, and living off my military pension. They thought my service ended the day I took off my uniform. They had no idea that my daily commute ended at a highly secure, nondescript building that housed the regional headquarters of the Department of Justice. I pulled into the subterranean parking garage and walked toward the reinforced elevators. I badged through 3 separate layers of biometric security checkpoints before reaching my office. The heavy steel doors locked behind me, sealing me inside the Financial Crimes Division. This was my domain. I am a senior special agent specializing in tracing illicit funds, tracking down money launderers, and dismantling criminal empires brick by brick. My family saw a broken and stubborn veteran holding onto an empty patch of grass. The federal government saw a financial sniper capable of destroying offshore syndicates with a few keystrokes. I sat down at my desk and fired up my dual monitors. The hum of the secure servers was the only sound in my office. I had spent the entire weekend letting the anger run its course, letting the sting of betrayal fade into a calculated and absolute resolve. Now it was time to work. I opened a secure terminal and pulled up the public filings for the proposed luxury resort that Brittany and her father were planning to build on my grandfather's land. The project was registered under a limited liability company called Caldwell Shoreline Developments. On paper, it looked like a standard upscale real estate venture. It boasted plans for an 18-hole golf course, a boutique hotel, and luxury waterfront condominiums. But in my line of work, you learn very quickly that the prettiest facades usually hide the ugliest secrets. People like the Caldwell family do not fight this hard for 50 acres of land just to build a resort. There was plenty of commercial real estate available in the state. They wanted my land specifically because it was off the grid, unencumbered by corporate histories, and completely clean. It was the perfect blank canvas for a dirty operation. I started pulling the thread. Using federal financial tracking databases, I began to trace the funding for Caldwell Shoreline Developments. I bypassed their local bank records and went straight to the corporate holding structures. The money was not coming from legitimate real estate loans or standard venture capital. The initial capital for the resort project was being funneled through a labyrinth of shell companies registered in Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming. I spent hours cross-referencing the tax identification numbers of these shell companies with federal watch lists and known syndicate operations. The pattern emerged within hours, and it was staggering. Brittany and her father were not just greedy real estate developers. They were the architects of a massive interstate money laundering operation. The Caldwell family business was essentially a giant washing machine for illicit cash. They would take dirty money from organized crime syndicates across the eastern seaboard, funnel it through these untraceable shell companies, and then use it to buy and develop prime real estate. Once a resort or a commercial complex was built, they would sell it or operate it, turning that dirty cash into squeaky clean legitimate revenue. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. As I clicked through the transaction histories, I saw hundreds of millions of dollars moving through their accounts, disguised as construction costs, consulting fees, and land acquisitions. They were paying phantom contractors for work that was never done, and inflating the costs of materials to wash the syndicate money. I sat back and watched the data scroll across my screen, feeling a deep sense of disgust. This was the wealth my parents were bowing down to. This was the prestige they wanted so desperately to be a part of. And now they needed my grandfather's untouched, pristine 50 acres to wash their next massive payout. That was why Brittany was so aggressive. That was why they needed the land so desperately. The criminal syndicates they worked for were likely demanding a clean return on their investments, and my family estate was the sacrificial lamb the Caldwells had chosen to make it happen. It was not just about building a golf course for my brother to play on. Isaiah was just a useful idiot, a convenient local face they could use as a minority partner to secure tax breaks and favorable zoning permits. They were going to use my family heritage as a dumping ground for criminal money, and my parents were cheering them on, blinded by the illusion of proximity to wealth. They were willing to let a criminal syndicate pave over the soil my grandfather bled for just so they could brag at the country club about their successful son. I leaned back in my chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off my face. The puzzle was almost complete, but I needed the final piece. I needed to know exactly how confident they were that they could steal my land through the local courts. Brittany had proudly declared that her father owned the legal system in our town, and the assignment of Judge Harrison Atwood to my case proved she was not bluffing. But judges do not rig real estate cases for free. I needed the transaction. I needed the digital footprint that proved the local justice system had been compromised by the Caldwell money machine. I pulled up the financial records for Judge Harrison Atwood. A local judge earning a standard government salary should have a very predictable financial profile. But Atwood was living far beyond his means. He had a sprawling vacation home in the Bahamas, multiple luxury vehicles, and 2 children attending expensive private universities without a single student loan on record. I ran a deep background sweep on his wife, his siblings, and his extended family, looking for the hidden accounts where the bribes were being stashed. It took me until Wednesday night, cross-referencing offshore routing numbers with local property tax records, to finally find the bleeding vein. There it was, buried under a generic consulting firm, registered to the maiden name of the judge's mother. A direct offshore wire transfer originating from one of the Caldwell shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Exactly $500,000 had been deposited into the hidden account of Judge Atwood just 48 hours after Brittany filed the lawsuit against me. It was a blatant, untraceable bribe meant to guarantee the outcome of the property dispute. They had literally purchased the judge who was sitting on my case. They paid him $500,000 to ignore my grandfather's deed, to ignore the law, and to hand my legacy over to a criminal enterprise. I sat in the silence of my office, staring at the damning evidence on my screen. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with a sickening click. Brittany and her father needed the land to launder their syndicate money. They knew I would never sell it, so they fabricated a lawsuit attacking my mental health. They bribed Judge Atwood to ignore my evidence and rule in their favor. And my own parents and brother were acting as willing accomplices to a federal crime just to secure a crumb of fake social status. The betrayal was so deep it bypassed anger and settled into a realm of pure, absolute justice. I was no longer looking at my family. I was looking at suspects in a federal racketeering investigation. My desk phone rang, breaking the heavy silence of the room. It was my supervisor, the special agent in charge of our division, asking for a progress report on my caseload. I transferred the Caldwell files to a secure encrypted hard drive and walked down the hall to his office. I closed the blinds and locked the door behind me. I laid the preliminary findings on his desk and watched his eyes widen as he traced the money from the Caldwell syndicate directly to a sitting judge. "We have been trying to crack the Caldwell operation for 2 years, he said, looking up at me in absolute disbelief. They always hide behind local politicians and obscure real estate laws. How did you just map their entire offshore laundering network in 3 days? I looked him dead in the eye and kept my voice perfectly flat. Because they made the mistake of trying to steal my grandfather's land. My supervisor immediately authorized a full federal probe. We bypassed the local authorities entirely, knowing the police department and city council were likely compromised by Caldwell money. We assembled a strike team of forensic accountants and tactical agents. We began preparing the federal indictments, securing the wiretap warrants, and drafting the asset seizure protocols. We were going to freeze every single bank account associated with the Caldwell family. We were going to seize their properties, their luxury cars, and their offshore funds. We were building a massive federal case that would put Brittany, her father, and Judge Atwood in federal prison for decades. But I requested one very specific condition. I asked my supervisor to let the local civil trial proceed exactly as scheduled. I wanted Brittany and the judge to believe their plan was working perfectly. I wanted them to step into that courtroom feeling invincible so that when the hammer fell, it would crush them completely. My supervisor smiled a grim, knowing smile and agreed to my terms. The federal trap was set. For the next month, I played my part to absolute perfection. I let my family believe I was drowning in fear and isolation. I ignored the barrage of taunting messages that filled my phone. My mother sent me passive-aggressive emails telling me to just give up and sign the land over to save myself the legal fees. She wrote that she was praying for my mental health and hoped I would stop being so selfish. My brother Isaiah posted vague statuses on social media about toxic family members getting their karma and how the truth always comes out in court. Brittany strutted around town acting like she already owned the estate, even bringing contractors out to the edge of my property line to take measurements for her fake resort. I responded to none of it. I sat in silence at my kitchen table reviewing federal subpoenas while David rubbed my shoulders, offering his unwavering support. He watched me work night after night, marveling at the quiet storm I was brewing. "They really have no idea what is coming for them," he whispered one evening as I finalized the arrest warrant for Judge Atwood. I simply nodded and closed my laptop. I let my family echo in their own chamber of arrogance. They interpreted my lack of response as submission. They thought my silence was the silence of defeat. They told their friends that I was cowering in the dark, terrified of the powerful people they had aligned themselves with. They threw parties celebrating their impending victory, convinced that they had outsmarted the difficult veteran daughter who dared to stand in their way. They were so incredibly wrong. My silence was not defeat. It was the silence of a predator waiting in the tall grass, watching its prey walk blindly into a trap from which there was absolutely no escape. Every time they sent a mocking text message, I added another charge to their federal indictment. Every time they bragged about their wealth, I tracked another offshore account. They thought they were preparing for a simple property dispute in a rigged local court. They did not know they were walking straight into the jaws of the United States Department of Justice, and I was holding the leash. The days leading up to the trial felt like moving through deep water. I had deliberately constructed an illusion of vulnerability, and my family fell for it with an eagerness that was almost pitiful to watch. They thrived on the idea that they had broken me. In their minds, my silence was a white flag. I stopped answering my phone. I let the blinds in my house stay drawn. I parked my car in the garage so it looked like I was hiding inside, refusing to face the town that was actively whispering my name. I gave them exactly the performance they wanted, and because they were so blinded by their own greed, they did not notice the steel trap closing around their ankles. My brother Isaiah sent me text messages almost every single day. They started out as fake attempts at sympathy, urging me to just surrender the deed so I would not have to suffer the embarrassment of a public trial. When I ignored those, his messages turned vicious. He bragged about the corner office he was going to have at the new resort. He sent me pictures of luxury cars he was planning to buy with his cut of the development money. He actually had the audacity to text me that he hoped the local mental health clinic had a bed ready for me when the judge officially ruled me incompetent. He was writing his own confession in real time, documenting his financial motives and his malicious intent on a cellular network that federal agents were currently monitoring. Brittany was even more reckless. She thrived on cruelty, and she wanted to make sure I felt the full weight of her perceived power. She sent me emails from her corporate account detailing the exact legal fees her father was paying their attorneys, boasting that they could drag this out until I was bankrupt. She even sent a passive-aggressive floral arrangement to my house with a card that read, "Thinking of your mental health during this difficult transition." She was so arrogant, so convinced that her wealth insulated her from consequence, that she became incredibly sloppy. Her emails contained copied lines to her father's shell companies. Her text messages casually referenced private conversations she had with Judge Atwood. She thought she was intimidating a helpless veteran. She did not realize she was hand-delivering evidence to a senior investigator of the Department of Justice. And then, there were my parents. Julian and Brenda Thorne were busy doing what they did best, putting on a performance for their wealthy friends. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that my father was already bragging at the country club about the massive real estate deal his son was brokering. He was accepting congratulations for a resort that had not even broken ground on land he did not even own. My mother was apparently shopping for a new wardrobe to wear to the courtroom, telling her friends that it was a tragedy her daughter had lost her mind, but that the family was doing what was necessary to protect our heritage. They had completely written me off. They had erased my lifetime of service, my character, and my sanity just to fit the narrative that Brittany had constructed for them. I read their messages and heard their rumors, and I did not shed a single tear. The part of me that still needed my parents' approval had died the moment they stood in my yard and demanded I surrender my grandfather's legacy. While they were busy picking out outfits for their victory lap, I was sitting in a secure briefing room at the federal building, finalizing the mechanism that would destroy them. My supervisor had brought in a joint task force of FBI agents and federal prosecutors. We were sitting around a heavy wooden table reviewing the final asset preservation strategy. Catching them in a money laundering scheme was one thing, but I needed to ensure that my grandfather's land was completely untouchable regardless of whatever corrupt ruling judge Atwood tried to issue from his bench. I explained my strategy to the room. Under federal law, properties tied to active federal racketeering and money laundering investigations can be placed under immediate federal jurisdiction to prevent the disposal or transfer of assets. But I took it one step further. Because my grandfather was one of the first Black landowners in that specific agricultural district, and because of his documented historical contributions to the local farming cooperative, we qualified for an emergency historical preservation trust. I worked with the Department of the Interior and our federal legal team to quietly execute a binding transfer of jurisdiction. It took mountains of paperwork and a late-night signature from a federal magistrate, but we got it done. The 50-acre Thorne estate was officially placed into a protected federal trust under my name. The moment that digital stamp hit the federal registry, the local courts were completely stripped of their authority over the property. I sat in the federal building staring at the confirmation document on the screen. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering. It meant that Judge Atwood had absolutely zero jurisdiction over the land. He could bang his gavel until his arm fell off. He could sign 100 local decrees demanding I hand the property to my brother. It would mean absolutely nothing. The land was federally protected. The lawsuit Brittany filed was now a legally dead document addressing a property that the local court could not even perceive. But the true beauty of this trap was that none of them knew it. The preservation order was sealed under the active federal investigation. Brittany, her father, and Judge Atwood were operating under the assumption that the local court still held the keys to the kingdom. They had paid a $500,000 bribe to a judge to steal a piece of land that was already locked away in a federal vault. This meant that Atwood was going to sit on his bench and preside over a sham trial committing overt wire fraud and judicial corruption for a payout that was completely useless. They were digging their own graves and paying for the privilege. My supervisor looked at me across the briefing table and shook his head in quiet disbelief. He told me it was the most perfectly orchestrated dead end he had ever seen in a financial crimes case. The FBI lead agent confirmed that their tactical teams were ready. The moment Judge Atwood attempted to execute the property transfer in open court, the trap would spring shut. It was the final nail in the coffin, linking the bribe directly to the judicial action. All I had to do was walk into that courtroom, play the part of the defeated defendant, and let them hang themselves with their own arrogance. The final days before the hearing were a masterclass in psychological discipline. I went about my routine in complete silence. David was my anchor through the storm. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and he watched the preparations with a quiet, intense pride. He helped me lay out my uniform for the trial. We decided against my actual military dress blues. I did not want to give the judge the satisfaction of seeing me in full military submission. Instead, I opted for a sharply tailored charcoal gray business suit. It was the armor of a federal agent, not a local civilian. The morning of the trial arrived with a heavy gray sky pouring rain over the city. It felt like the earth itself was preparing to wash away the dirt my family had tracked into our lives. I woke up early, long before the sun had a chance to break through the clouds. The house was completely still. I walked into the kitchen and poured a cup of black coffee standing by the window, listening to the rain hit the glass. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about how hard he fought just to be treated as a human being in a world that wanted him to be nothing. I thought about how he had looked at me when I enlisted in the Navy, telling me that true power was not about the volume of your voice, but the weight of your actions. Today I was going to make sure the weight of my actions crushed the people who tried to dishonor his memory. I walked back into the bedroom to get dressed. The charcoal suit fit perfectly. It was sharp, unyielding, and entirely professional. I tied my hair back into a sleek bun, leaving no room for softness. Then I walked over to my dresser and picked up the small velvet box sitting next to my jewelry. I opened the box and looked at the navy cross resting on the dark fabric. The bronze cross, the eagle, the ship, the anchor. It was not just a piece of metal. It was the blood in the sand. It was the suffocating heat of the desert. It was the desperate, frantic moments pulling my teammates to safety while the world exploded around us. It was the physical embodiment of honor, courage, and absolute sacrifice. My family thought they could strip me of my dignity. They thought they could define me by their shallow, empty standards. They were about to find out what real sacrifice looked like. I lifted the medal from the box and carefully, meticulously pinned it to the left lapel of my charcoal jacket. The bronze gleamed against the dark fabric, catching the dim morning light. It was a bold statement. Wearing a military valor medal on civilian clothes to a local civil trial was highly unusual, but I wanted them to see it. I wanted Brittany to look at the undeniable proof of my sanity and my service. I wanted my parents to be forced to stare at the honor they had tried to pretend did not exist. I wanted Judge Atwood to sit on his corrupt throne and look at a woman who had given more to her country in a single afternoon than he had given in his entire miserable life. David walked into the bedroom fully dressed in a sharp black suit. He stopped and looked at me, taking in the charcoal jacket and the navy cross resting over my heart. His eyes softened with a mixture of deep love and profound respect. He walked over to me, slowly closing the distance between us. He reached out and gently adjusted the collar of my jacket, ensuring the medal sat perfectly straight. He did not ask if I was ready. He did not ask if I was nervous. He knew the woman standing in front of him was not the scapegoat daughter of Julian and Brenda Thorne. The woman standing in front of him was an apex predator of the federal government about to walk into a room full of prey. David leaned down and pressed a warm, lingering kiss to my forehead. He looked me dead in the eyes, a fierce protective fire burning in his gaze. "Give them hell, Tamara," he whispered. I looked back at my husband, feeling the calm, cold certainty settle into my bones. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs. "I am not just going to give them hell," I replied, my voice smooth and dangerously quiet. "I am going to bring the whole inferno right to their front door." I grabbed my briefcase containing the federal dossiers, the unsealed indictments, and the jurisdictional transfer documents. David took my hand and we walked out of our home, stepping into the pouring rain. We got into the car and drove toward the downtown courthouse. Every traffic light we passed, every intersection we crossed, felt like the ticking of a countdown clock. My family and their corrupt allies were currently sitting in a courtroom feeling victorious, putting on their expensive clothes and practicing their fake tears. They were fully prepared to steal my legacy and destroy my name. They had no idea that the Grim Reaper was sitting in the passenger seat of a car heading straight for them, and she was wearing a Navy cross. The heavy wooden doors of the downtown courthouse loomed ahead of us as David pulled the car to the curb. The rain was still coming down in sheets, washing the stone steps slick and gray. I stepped out of the vehicle, the cold air hitting my face, but I felt nothing except the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. I gripped the leather handle of my briefcase, holding the federal dossiers that were about to tear my family apart. David walked beside me, his presence a silent shield against the hostile territory we were about to enter. We walked through the metal detectors, and I handed over my weapon declaring my federal status to the security guards, but asking them to keep it off the local record. They nodded respectfully and let us through. The echoes of our footsteps sounded like a slow drumbeat down the marble hallway heading straight for courtroom number 4. I pushed open the heavy double doors and walked into the room. The air inside was thick and stale, smelling of old wood and cheap perfume. My eyes immediately scanned the gallery, and the seating arrangements told me everything I needed to know about where loyalty ended and betrayal began. Sitting directly behind the plaintiff's table were my parents, Julian and Brenda Thorne. They were dressed in their country club, best looking like they were attending a society luncheon, rather than a trial, to strip their daughter of her inheritance. My mother wore a tailored pastel suit, and my father had on a crisp blazer. They did not even look at me when I walked down the aisle. My own parents, the people who raised me, completely turned their backs on me to face the front of the room. They had physically and symbolically aligned themselves with the people trying to destroy me. At the plaintiff's table sat Brittany and my brother Isaiah. Brittany wore a stark white designer dress, looking every bit the entitled heiress she was. She was leaning over, whispering to her high-priced local attorney, a man known for his aggressive and underhanded tactics. Isaiah sat next to her, staring down at his hands. He looked pale and nervous, but every time Brittany whispered to him, he would nod eagerly like an obedient dog. He refused to make eye contact with me. The golden child of the Thorne family could not even look his little sister in the eye while he helped his wife steal from her. David and I took our seats at the defense table. I did not hire a local attorney. I sat alone, representing myself, with David in the gallery right behind me. The bailiff announced the arrival of Judge Harrison Atwood, and everyone in the room stood. Atwood walked in with an air of absolute arrogant authority. He was an older man with a red face and a permanent scowl. He settled into his leather chair behind the elevated bench and immediately glared down at me. There was no pretense of impartiality in his eyes. He looked at me not as a citizen seeking justice, but as a nuisance standing between him and his $500,000 bribe. I sat down and arranged my files on the desk, deliberately placing the federal folder at the bottom of the stack out of sight. Judge Atwood banged his wooden gavel to open the proceedings. He did not even bother to read the opening statements properly before handing the floor over to Brittany and her attorney. The lawyer stood up and launched into a theatrical speech about how I was a damaged veteran suffering from deep psychological wounds. He claimed that my grandfather was suffering from dementia in his final months, and that I had used my aggressive military training to isolate the old man and force him to sign the property over to me. It was a disgusting manipulation of reality. He painted Isaiah as the caring eldest son who was wrongfully dispossessed of his birthright. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and calmly presented the official medical records from the Department of Veterans Affairs and my grandfather's primary care physician. The records explicitly proved that I was in perfect mental health, and more importantly, that my grandfather was completely lucid and of sound mind on the day he signed the deed. Brittany told her lawyer to object. The lawyer stood and claimed the medical documents were hearsay and had not been properly authenticated by a local specialist. It was the most ridiculous legal argument I had ever heard. Federal medical records are admissible in any court in the country. But Judge Atwood did not even hesitate. He leaned over the bench and declared the objection sustained. He threw out the concrete medical evidence of my grandfather's sanity with a single wave of his hand. I presented the sworn affidavits from the notary public and the 2 independent witnesses who were present when the deed was transferred. Brittany and her lawyer objected again, claiming the witnesses were biased because they were friends of my grandfather. Judge Atwood sustained the objection. He struck the witness statements from the record. Every time I opened my mouth to present a piece of irrefutable evidence, the judge found a bizarre, legally baseless reason to dismiss it. He was running a kangaroo court in broad daylight. He was not even trying to hide his corruption. He was so confident in his power and the backing of the Caldwell family money that he felt completely untouchable. The legal charade continued for another hour. Brittany's lawyer brought forward a supposed expert witness who had never even met me or my grandfather. This hired professional sat on the stand and testified that combat veterans often displayed coercive behaviors towards vulnerable family members. He spun a complete fiction based on malicious stereotypes. I objected to his testimony, citing his lack of direct evaluation and clear conflict of interest. Judge Atwood slammed his gavel and threatened to hold me in contempt for interrupting the witness. The bias was so thick you could choke on it. Atwood was actively facilitating a character assassination, refusing to let a single piece of the truth enter the official court transcript. Across the aisle, Brittany was having the time of her life. She kept turning around to smile at my parents, who nodded back at her with encouraging smiles. My mother actually reached out and patted Brittany on the shoulder, whispering that everything was going to be all right. I watched my mother comfort the woman trying to destroy me. The betrayal washed over me again, but it did not break me. It just made the trap I had set feel that much more justified. Brittany turned her attention back to me and offered a sickeningly sweet smirk. She looked at my charcoal suit and let her eyes fall on the Navy cross pinned to my lapel. Her smirk widened into a malicious grin. She leaned over and whispered something into the ear of her attorney, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. Isaiah finally looked up for a brief second. He saw the way the judge was systematically dismantling my defense. He saw the clear path to his unearned wealth opening up before him. He leaned into Brittany and whispered something eagerly, a greedy smile briefly appearing on his face before he ducked his head down again. He thought he had won. He thought his rich wife and her corrupt connections had successfully stolen the legacy he never deserved. My family sat behind them, bathing in the toxic glow of their perceived victory. They truly believed they had cornered me. They thought I was helpless and alone at the mercy of a judge who had already been bought and paid for. I sat perfectly still in my chair, absorbing the hostility radiating from every corner of the room. The air was thick with their arrogance. The judge sneered down at me, shuffling his papers with the bored impatience of a man who already knew how he was going to rule. The lawyer for the plaintiff paced the floor, looking like a peacock strutting in front of a captive audience. And my family, my own flesh and blood, sat comfortably in their betrayal, waiting for the gavel to fall and crush my life. They wanted me to show weakness. They wanted me to raise my voice or show frustration so they could point at me and claim I was exactly the unstable veteran they had described in their fabricated lawsuit. I gave them absolutely nothing. I kept my posture straight, my breathing even, and my face devoid of all emotion. The self-control I had learned in the military served me well in this moment. I had remained calm in the middle of raging sandstorms and deafening gunfire. The petty greed of a small-town judge and an entitled heiress was nothing compared to the things I had survived. I was letting them exhaust all their ammunition. I was letting the judge dig his grave so deep that he would never see the light of day again. My hand rested lightly on the table, mere inches from the briefcase that held their destruction. The kangaroo court was in full session, and the fools were celebrating their impending triumph. They were blinded by the shine of their stolen money and the comfort of their rigged system. They did not realize they were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship. I took a slow, quiet breath and prepared for the moment they would push me to the edge. I knew it was coming. Brittany and her lawyer were whispering together, hatching the final insult they would try to hurl my way before asking the judge to rule. I just waited in the silence, holding the keys to their complete and total downfall. The silence in the courtroom was suddenly broken by the scraping of a wooden chair against the floor. Brittany's lawyer stood up, smoothing the front of his expensive suit. He walked out from behind the plaintiff's table and began to pace the short distance between the bench and where I sat. He had a theatrical way of moving, clearly playing to the audience of my parents, who watched him with rapt attention. He stopped pacing and turned to face Judge Atwood. He let out a long, dramatic sigh before he began to speak. "Your Honor, we have spent the morning establishing the aggressive and unstable nature of the defendant. We have shown how her military background has alienated her from her loving family. But we do not even need to look at medical records to see her attempts at intimidation. We only need to look at what she wore to your courtroom today." He turned on his heel and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. He pointed straight at the Navy cross resting on my charcoal lapel. The audacity of his gesture was staggering. Your Honor, the defense is sitting here in a civil property dispute wearing one of the highest military combat decorations in existence. She is not in uniform. This is not a memorial service. This is a calculated and deliberate intimidation tactic. She is parading this medal to project an aura of danger and violence. She is trying to send a message to my client and to this court that she is a trained killer who operates above the laws of polite society. It is a hostile act meant to pressure the bench and terrify her own family. I sat perfectly still and let his words wash over me. I looked down at the bronze cross. My mind instantly transported back to the exact moment I earned it. I remembered the suffocating heat of the desert sun beating down on the wreckage of a convoy. I remembered the deafening sound of enemy gunfire tearing through the metal of our vehicles. I remembered the smell of burning fuel and copper. I remembered pulling a heavy, wounded teammate out of a burning transport, dragging him through the sand, while bullets kicked up dirt mere inches from my face. I remembered pressing my hands into his wounds, fighting to keep him bleeding out while we waited for the medical evacuation chopper. I did not do it for glory. I did not do it to intimidate a pathetic local lawyer in a rigged courtroom years later. I did it because it was my duty. The medal was a symbol of absolute sacrifice, of putting the lives of others before my own. And now this man in his comfortable air-conditioned life was pointing at it and calling it a symbol of aggression. He was weaponizing the greatest honor of my life to help a spoiled heiress steal a piece of land. Judge Atwood leaned forward, resting his elbows on the heavy oak bench. His face was flushed with self-importance. He looked at the lawyer and nodded slowly, as if he were absorbing a brilliant legal argument. Then he turned his dark, hostile eyes toward me. He picked up his wooden gavel and banged it loudly against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed through the silent room, demanding absolute attention. Mrs. Thorne. The judge barked, his voice dripping with condescension. This is a civil courtroom, not a military parade. We are here to resolve a property dispute, not to celebrate your violent past. I will not have you flaunting symbols of violence to pressure this court, or to threaten your family members who are simply seeking their rightful inheritance. He paused to let his words sink in. He wanted to make sure everyone in the gallery heard him dressing down a veteran. He wanted to show Brittany and her father that he was worth every penny of the $500,000 bribe they had wired to his offshore account. Remove that medal immediately, Atwood commanded, pointing his gavel at me. I will not allow you to wear it in my presence. If you refuse to comply with my order, I will hold you in contempt of court and have the bailiffs remove you from this room in handcuffs. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. It was a physical shockwave of disbelief. Even the armed bailiff standing by the door shifted uncomfortably, shifting his weight and looking down at the floor. Telling a decorated combat veteran to strip off the Navy Cross because it offended the delicate sensibilities of a corrupt judge was an insult so profound it bordered on sacrilege. It was the ultimate disrespect to the armed forces, to the sacrifices made in the dirt and the blood, and to every concept of justice this room was supposed to represent. I could hear the movement behind me in the gallery. I could hear David shifting in his seat. I could hear the sharp intake of breath as my husband fought every instinct in his body to keep from jumping over the wooden railing and tearing the judge apart with his bare hands. David respected my service more than anyone. He knew the nightmares I had survived and the physical scars I carried from that deployment. To sit there and watch a corrupt official humiliate me for a bribe was agonizing for him. But he stayed in his seat because he trusted me. He knew I had a plan. I shifted my gaze slightly to look at the plaintiff's table. Brittany was practically glowing. A massive, triumphant smile stretched across her face. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated victory in her eyes. She thought she had finally broken me. She thought she had stripped me of the one thing I held sacred. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms and basking in the absolute humiliation of her sister-in-law. Next to her, Isaiah kept his head bowed. The golden child, the beloved firstborn son, could not even look up to see his little sister being degraded by the court. He just stared at his hands, pretending he was not complicit in the complete destruction of our family bond. But the most devastating reaction came from the row directly behind them. I looked at my parents, Julian and Brenda Thorne, the people who had brought me into this world. They were shaking their heads. My mother was actually whispering to my father, her face twisted into a mask of embarrassment. She was embarrassed by me. She leaned forward and whispered to Brittany's lawyer, apologizing for my behavior. She told him that I had always been defiant, and that she was so sorry the judge had to deal with my lack of respect for authority. My father nodded in agreement, looking at me with total disgust. They were watching a corrupt judge strip their daughter of a military honor she had bled for, and their only concern was that I was ruining their social standing with the wealthy daughter-in-law. They had completely severed the last remaining thread of my loyalty to them. There was no going back from this moment. They had chosen their side, and they had chosen the side of the enemy. The silence in the courtroom stretched out heavy and suffocating. Everyone was waiting for me to react. They were waiting for the angry veteran to snap. They were waiting for me to yell, to throw a fit, to argue about my rights, so the judge could gleefully order the bailiffs to drag me away in chains. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted a dramatic meltdown that would validate every single lie Brittany had posted on the internet. My eyes locked onto Judge Atwood. I did not blink. I did not frown. I did not show a single ounce of the burning inferno of rage that was currently incinerating my soul. My face was a mask of cold, impenetrable ice. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The movement was deliberate and measured. I stood at military attention, my shoulders back, my spine completely straight. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the sound of the rain hitting the windows outside. I raised my right hand to my left lapel. My fingers brushed against the cool bronze of the Navy Cross. I took my time. I unclasped the backing of the pin with steady, unshaking hands. I pulled the needle free from the charcoal fabric of my suit jacket. I held the medal in my hand for a brief second, feeling the weight of the medal. The weight of the lives saved and the lives lost. I lowered my hand and placed the Navy Cross directly onto the wooden surface of the defense table. The metal made a soft, sharp clink as it hit the wood. The sound echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. I did not sit back down. I stood there staring directly into the dark, hostile eyes of Harrison Atwood. I let the silence stretch for another 3 seconds, ensuring that every single person in the room was hanging on my next breath. "You are absolutely right, Your Honor," I said. My voice was smooth, even and dangerously quiet. It carried across the room, effortlessly bouncing off the walls and sinking straight into the chest of every person listening. This medal represents integrity and honor. It represents the kind of sacrifice that people in this room could not possibly begin to understand. I looked at the medal sitting on the table and then brought my eyes back up to pierce the judge. "It does not belong in a room as corrupt as this one." The words hung in the air, a devastating indictment delivered with absolute terrifying calm. I had not raised my voice, but the impact of the statement felt like a physical blow to the room. Judge Atwood turned a vibrant shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his white collar. His mouth opened and closed as he struggled to process the sheer audacity of my defiance. He gripped his gavel, his knuckles turning white, preparing to bring down the full wrath of his judicial power upon me. Brittany lost her triumphant smile, her face twisting into a scowl of pure hatred. My parents gasped out loud, shocked that I would dare speak to a judge in such a manner. They thought this was the end of my resistance. They thought my compliance in removing the medal was a surrender followed by a petty insult. They thought they had pushed me into a corner from which there was no escape. They thought the gavel that was about to fall would mark the official end of my legacy and the beginning of their stolen wealth. But as Judge Atwood raised his wooden hammer high into the air, ready to hold me in contempt and order the bailiffs to take me away, I kept my eyes locked on his. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I just waited for him to reach the absolute peak of his corrupt power. Because the medal sitting on the table was not the only piece of metal I had brought into the courtroom today. And the one hiding in my inner jacket pocket was about to burn his entire world to the ground. Judge Atwood gripped his wooden gavel so tightly I thought the handle might splinter in his thick fist. The deep purple hue of his face spread down his neck, disappearing beneath the stiff white collar of his judicial robe. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own unrestrained fury. He had expected a veteran to break under his absolute authority. He had expected me to yell or cry or beg for mercy when faced with the systematic dismantling of my life and legacy. Instead, I had handed him a cold, calculated dose of absolute reality. And he had no idea how to process a defendant who completely refused to fear him. "You are out of order," he bellowed, his voice cracking slightly as it echoed through the cavernous courtroom. "You are in direct contempt of this court, Miss Thorne. I should have the bailiff place you in handcuffs this very second and throw you in a holding cell for the remainder of these proceedings. You have shown a flagrant disrespect for the bench, for the law, and for the dignified nature of this civil process. You think because you served overseas you are somehow above the basic rules of a civilized society." He glared at the bailiff standing near the heavy wooden doors, a silent command to be ready to move on me. The armed officer shifted his weight, looking incredibly conflicted. No one in that room wanted to be the person forced to put handcuffs on a decorated combat veteran who had just calmly surrendered her Navy Cross, simply because a corrupt judge threw a temper tantrum. The thick, heavy silence returned, pressing down on everyone in the gallery. I could hear the frantic, impatient whispering coming from the plaintiff's table across the aisle. Brittany leaned across her chair, her expensive perfume drifting across the space between us. She was practically vibrating with nervous, greedy energy. She did not care about the wounded pride of the judge. She did not care about the legal protocols or the threats of contempt, or the morality of stripping a veteran of her honors. She only cared about the 50 acres of pristine lakefront property that was currently hanging in the balance. She wanted her luxury resort. She wanted her money, and she wanted it right now. The longer the judge ranted, the longer she had to wait to get her hands on my grandfather's land. "Just rule on the property, Judge," Brittany whispered loudly, her voice carrying easily across the silent room. She did not even try to hide her contempt for the legal process. She is trying to stall because she knows she has lost. Do not let her waste any more of the court's time. Just rule on it. She has nothing left. Isaiah sat next to her, nodding eagerly like a puppet on a string. My brother looked at the judge with wide, desperate eyes, silently begging him to finish the job so they could all go home and celebrate their stolen wealth. Behind them in the gallery, my parents, Julian and Brenda, shifted in their seats. They were practically holding their breath, waiting for the final blow to fall. My mother leaned forward, whispering to my father that it was almost over, that the family reputation would soon be saved, and Isaiah would finally have the respect and financial standing he deserved. They had entirely convinced themselves that destroying my life was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of their social standing. They looked at my empty lapel where the medal used to be, and they felt absolutely zero remorse. In their minds, I had brought this entire humiliation upon myself by simply refusing to surrender what was rightfully mine. Judge Atwood heard Brittany whisper, and it seemed to snap him out of his blind rage. He took a deep breath, smoothing the front of his black robe, and deliberately forced his face to relax into a mask of smug, judicial superiority. He realized that screaming at me was not going to give him the satisfaction he craved. Putting me in a holding cell would only delay the transaction that he had been bribed $500,000 to execute. The ultimate punishment was not locking me up. The ultimate punishment was taking away my grandfather's legacy right in front of my eyes and handing it to the people who hated me. He sat back in his large leather chair and picked up the stack of fabricated legal documents that Brittany's lawyer had submitted earlier that morning. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at me with a cold, triumphant sneer. The room held its breath. David sat completely rigid in the row behind me, his eyes burning holes into the side of the judge's head. My husband knew what was in the briefcase resting by my feet, but the agonizing weight was taking a toll on everyone. "The court has heard enough testimony for one day." Judge Atwood began, his voice dropping into a formal, measured cadence. The evidence presented by the plaintiffs paints a very clear and deeply troubling picture of the events leading up to the transfer of the Thorne estate. We have reviewed the testimonies regarding the mental decline of the deceased. We have heard from expert witnesses who have detailed the ways in which combat veterans can utilize coercive tactics to isolate and manipulate vulnerable elderly family members. He paused, looking over the rim of his glasses to make sure I was paying attention to his lies. I stared back at him, my face a wall of unyielding stone. Furthermore, the behavior of the defendant in this very courtroom today only serves to validate the claims made by the plaintiffs. Judge Atwood continued, leaning into his microphone so his words would be captured perfectly by the court stenographer. The defendant has shown a shocking lack of emotional stability, a total disregard for familial duty, and a hostile disposition that frankly makes it abundantly clear she is not fit to manage an estate of this magnitude or historical significance. It is the duty of this court to correct injustices when they are brought to light and to ensure that family legacies are placed in the hands of those who are mentally and morally equipped to preserve them. Brittany let out a soft sigh of absolute relief. She reached out and grabbed the hand of my brother, squeezing it tightly. Isaiah finally sat up straight, pushing his shoulders back as if he had actually accomplished something to be proud of. My parents smiled at each other in the gallery, their long nightmare of dealing with their difficult daughter finally coming to a profitable end. They were already spending the resort money in their heads. They were already planning the country club dinners where they would brag about their eldest son, the brilliant real estate developer. Therefore, based on the overwhelming preponderance of evidence, Judge Atwood said, raising his right hand to grasp the handle of his wooden gavel, "It is the ruling of this court that the property deed transferring the 50-acre Thorne estate to the defendant is hereby invalidated due to undue influence and coercion." He lifted the gavel high into the air. The polished wood gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The descent of that hammer was supposed to be the final nail in my coffin. It was supposed to be the sound that ended my grandfather's dream and validated every single lie my family had ever told about me. Full ownership and title of the estate shall be immediately transferred to the rightful eldest heir, Isaiah Thorne, and his legal spouse, Brittany Caldwell Thorne. Judge Atwood announced the words rushing out of his mouth in a greedy blur. The gavel reached the apex of its arc. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum of sound waiting to be shattered by the strike of the wood. Brittany leaned forward, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. My mother pressed her hands to her chest in a gesture of fake religious gratitude. I did not wait for the gavel to fall. I calmly raised my right hand into the air, the movement sharp and deliberate, completely breaking the hypnotic spell of the judge's corrupt monologue. My voice cut through the heavy, stale air of the courtroom, echoing loudly off the wood-paneled walls. I did not wait for the gavel to fall. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and raised my voice. It sliced through the stale air like a steel blade. "Before you bring down that gavel and finalize your own federal indictment, Judge Atwood, I suggest you stop and realize who you are actually dealing with." The gavel froze in midair. Atwood stared at me, his eyes wide with a sudden creeping confusion. Brittany's smile faltered. "I am not just a retired medic," I declared, my voice echoing with icy absolute authority. "I am a senior special agent with the United States Department of Justice, and this local court has absolutely zero jurisdiction over my federally protected land." The heavy silence that followed my declaration felt like it was suffocating every single person in the room except for me and David. The gold and blue badge of the United States Department of Justice rested in the palm of my hand, catching the dull fluorescent light of the courtroom and reflecting it back into the terrified eyes of the people who had just tried to ruin my life. The words "Financial Crimes Division" hung in the stale air like a death sentence. I watched the blood completely drain from the face of Judge Harrison Atwood. His ruddy, confident complexion turned into a sickly gray pallor in a matter of seconds. He was a man who had spent his entire career believing he was the smartest person in the room, believing that his black robe shielded him from any and all consequences. But looking at my federal credentials, he suddenly realized he was nothing more than a local pawn caught in a massive federal trap. His mouth hung open slightly, but no words came out. His mind was desperately racing, trying to calculate how much I knew and how much evidence I had gathered. Across the aisle, Brittany was experiencing a catastrophic system failure of her own. Her smug, triumphant smile, the one she had worn like a crown since the moment she walked onto my grandfather's land, had vanished completely. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion and dread. She blinked rapidly, staring at the badge in my hand as if it were an optical illusion. She had spent her entire life operating under the assumption that her father's wealth made her family untouchable. She had never faced an opponent who could not be bought, bullied, or intimidated by the Caldwell money. And sitting right next to her, my brother Isaiah began to physically tremble. His shoulders shook and he gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table so tightly his knuckles turned white. The golden child of the Thorne family was finally realizing that the luxury resort he had been promised was actually a prison sentence disguised as a real estate development. He ducked his head, unable to look at me, unable to look at his wife, completely consumed by the cowardly panic that had always defined his character. In the gallery directly behind them, my parents Julian and Brenda stared in absolute horror. They had shown up to this courtroom ready to watch their difficult veteran daughter be publicly humiliated and legally stripped of her inheritance. They had dressed in their country club best, prepared to celebrate their entry into the upper echelons of local high society. But now they were sitting frozen in the wooden pews, staring at the federal badge I held in my hand. They were slowly, horrifyingly beginning to understand that their social climbing ambitions had just tied them directly to a federal investigation. My mother pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror she could not articulate. My father looked like he had been physically struck, his posture collapsing as the reality of my true profession destroyed the false narrative they had built around me. Before anyone in the room could find the breath to speak or object, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a sudden violent force. The loud crash of the thick wood hitting the plaster walls echoed like a thunderclap, shattering the paralyzed silence of the room. 6 armed federal agents strode through the doorway, moving with a terrifying synchronized precision. They wore dark suits and dark tactical vests with the bright yellow letters spelling FBI boldly printed across their chests and backs. Their expressions were hard-focused and entirely unbothered by the sudden gasp of panic that erupted from the gallery. The heavy thud of their boots on the marble floor sounded like the beating drum of absolute justice marching straight into the heart of a corrupt system. The local bailiff, who had been standing near the door with his hand resting casually on his duty belt, immediately stepped backward. He took one look at the federal tactical gear and the sheer authority radiating from the agents, and he completely surrendered his posture. He lowered his hands and pressed his back against the wall, yielding total control of his courtroom to the superior federal authority. He knew better than to interfere with a federal takedown. He wanted absolutely no part of whatever massive crime had just been uncovered in the room he was supposed to protect. I did not look back at the agents. I knew they were there. I had coordinated this exact breach sequence with my task force supervisor hours ago. I calmly tucked my federal badge back into the inner pocket of my charcoal suit jacket. I reached down and picked up the heavy leather briefcase that had been sitting patiently by my feet. I popped the brass latches, the metallic click slicing through the murmurs of the terrified spectators. I pulled out a massive, thick dossier stamped with the official seal of the Department of Justice. It was hundreds of pages of wire transfers, surveillance logs, shell company registrations, and sworn federal affidavits. It was the physical weight of their complete destruction. I walked out from behind the defense table holding the dossier in my hands. I did not even glance at Brittany or Isaiah as I passed their table. They were no longer a threat. They were just targets waiting to be processed. I walked directly up to the elevated judicial bench, stopping right in front of Judge Harrison Atwood. He stared down at me, his eyes wide with a panicked, desperate plea. But there was no mercy left in me. I lifted the heavy dossier and dropped it onto the polished wood of his bench. The thick stack of federal evidence hit the wood with a loud, heavy thud that made the judge physically flinch. My land was placed into a federal conservation trust a month ago, I said, my voice ringing out clear, cold, and perfectly steady. It carried across the entire courtroom, ensuring that my family and the gallery heard every single syllable. The local court never had any jurisdiction over the Thorne estate. Your entire lawsuit was a legally dead endeavor before you even filed the first piece of paperwork. I turned my head slightly, shifting my gaze to look directly into the terrified eyes of my sister-in-law. Brittany was gripping the edge of her table, her knuckles white, her breathing shallow and erratic. Your luxury resort project. Brittany is a front for interstate money laundering. I continued, letting the words sink into her privileged, arrogant brain. We have tracked every single shell company your father registered in Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming. We have mapped the entire network you used to wash syndicate money through commercial real estate developments. You were not trying to build a golf course for my brother. You were trying to use my grandfather's pristine legacy as a dumping ground for illicit cash. And you thought you could use a rigged local court to steal the only piece of clean, untraceable land left in the county. I turned my attention back to the bench, locking eyes with the disgraced man sitting in the black robe. Atwood was visibly shaking now, small beads of sweat forming on his forehead and upper lip. And Judge Atwood, I said, leaning slightly closer to the bench, the $500,000 wired to your offshore account from the Caldwell family yesterday morning has been seized by the feds. We tracked the routing numbers straight from the Cayman Islands to the dummy consulting firm registered in your mother's maiden name. We have the wiretap recordings of your conversations with Mr. Caldwell. We have the digital footprint of the bribe you accepted to rule against me today. The color completely drained from the room. The sheer magnitude of the federal trap I had laid out before them was too massive for their arrogant minds to process all at once. Judge Atwood stared at the thick federal dossier resting on his desk, as if it were a live explosive device. His hands began to tremble so violently that he lost his grip on the wooden gavel he had been holding. The gavel slipped from his sweaty fingers and rolled off the edge of the elevated desk, falling through the air and hitting the courtroom floor with a pathetic hollow clatter. It was the perfect auditory symbol of his shattered authority. Atwood opened his mouth to speak, but his voice was completely gone. He tried to inhale, but his chest was heaving with the onset of a full-blown panic attack. You cannot do this. He finally stammered, his voice a weak, pathetic croak. I am a sitting judge. I have judicial immunity. You have no authority to access my private financial records without a specialized federal warrant. This is an illegal search. This is a violation of my judicial privilege. He was rambling desperately, throwing out legal terms that meant absolutely nothing in the face of a federal racketeering indictment. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own corruption, trying to grab onto floating pieces of debris that were already sinking. I simply looked at him with profound disgust. Judicial immunity does not cover accepting a $500,000 bribe to facilitate interstate money laundering, Your Honor, I replied coldly. And the warrant to access your offshore accounts was signed by a federal magistrate 3 days ago. Your career is over. Your freedom is over. You are going to federal prison. The FBI agents did not wait for the judge to finish his pathetic stammering. They moved with swift, tactical efficiency. 2 of the agents bypassed the local bailiff and walked straight past the wooden partition that separated the gallery from the court floor. They did not ask for permission to approach the bench. They moved with the absolute authority of the United States government. They walked up the short steps leading to the elevated judicial platform, flanking Judge Atwood on both sides. The lead agent, a tall man with a jaw set like granite, looked down at the trembling judge. Harrison Atwood, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, wire fraud, and judicial corruption. The agent stated, his voice echoing clearly across the silent, stunned courtroom. Please stand up and step away from the desk. Keep your hands where we can see them. Atwood looked wildly around the room as if hoping someone would wake him from this nightmare. He looked at his local clerks, but they were completely frozen, staring down at their keyboards and refusing to make eye contact. He slowly pushed his heavy leather chair back and stood up, his knees buckling slightly under his own weight. The federal agents immediately grabbed his arms, pulling them firmly but professionally behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like the most beautiful piece of music I had ever heard. They began to guide the disgraced judge down the steps, marching him away from the throne he had abused for decades. While Atwood was being secured, the other 4 FBI agents moved directly toward the plaintiff's table. Brittany let out a loud, shrill scream as the agents approached her. She scrambled backward, knocking her wooden chair over onto the floor. She held her hands up in front of her face as if she could physically ward off the federal authorities with her manicured nails. "You cannot touch me!" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing with the desperate entitlement she had been raised on. "My father will sue all of you. My father will have your badges. I do not know anything about any shell companies. I am just a real estate developer. Get your hands off me." A female FBI agent stepped smoothly into Brittany's path, completely unbothered by the hysterical screaming. The agent reached out and grabbed Brittany's flailing wrists, twisting them behind her back with expert precision. "Brittany Caldwell Thorne, you are under arrest for corporate racketeering, interstate wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering." The agent recited calmly, locking the handcuffs tightly around Brittany's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly recommend you start using it immediately." Brittany began to sob uncontrollably, thrashing her body against the grip of the federal agent. Her pristine white designer dress was wrinkled and twisted, her perfect blonde hair falling into her tear-streaked face. She was crying out for her father, demanding to speak to a lawyer, screaming that I had set her up. She looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of her wealth, and her power reduced to a crying criminal caught in a federal sweep. Next to her, Isaiah was experiencing a complete psychological collapse. My older brother, the golden child who had spent his entire life looking down on me, was currently curled into a tight ball in his chair, his head resting on his knees. He was sobbing loudly and heavily, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his own profound stupidity. He had signed his name to dozens of fake corporate documents, trying to play the part of a big-shot resort developer. He had let his wife and her father use him as a convenient local shield for their criminal enterprise, and now he was going to pay the ultimate price for his greed. 2 agents stepped up to the table and tapped Isaiah firmly on the shoulder. "Isaiah Thorne." One of the agents said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Isaiah slowly lifted his head, his face covered in tears and mucus. He looked at the federal agents, and then he looked directly at me. His eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen in him before. The realization that his life was completely over, that his country club dreams were ending in a federal penitentiary, had finally shattered his delusions of grandeur. He stood up, his legs trembling so badly the agents had to support his weight to keep him from collapsing back onto the floor. I stood near the defense table, watching the tactical sweep unfold with cold satisfaction. I had warned them. I had told them not to come for my grandfather's legacy. I had told them that they were starting a war they could not possibly win. They had laughed at me. They had called me crazy and violent and unstable. They had tried to strip me of my military honor and steal the only piece of heritage my grandfather had left in this world. Now the gavel was on the floor. The judge was in chains, and the people who had tried to destroy me were being marched out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The federal trap had snapped shut with flawless, brutal precision, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. The metallic clicking of the handcuffs snapping shut around the wrists of Harrison. Atwood echoed across the wood-paneled walls of the courtroom. The man who had sat high above everyone else, looking down on me with absolute contempt, was now being physically guided down the steps of his own bench by 2 federal agents. He stumbled, his expensive leather shoes catching on the edge of the carpet. The FBI agents did not offer him any gentleness. They held him firmly by the arms, marching him past the wooden defense table where my torn transfer papers had sat just a day before. His black judicial robe swept against the floor, a stark contrast to the bright silver steel binding his hands behind his back. He kept his eyes squeezed shut completely, unable to look at the local court clerks and stenographers who were staring at him in absolute stunned silence. The man who had taken a $500,000 bribe to steal a legacy from a combat veteran was leaving his kingdom in disgrace. There would be no retirement party for him, no portrait hanging in the courthouse hallway. There would only be a federal cell and the crushing reality that he had traded his entire legacy for dirty money he would never get to spend. Across the aisle, the situation with Brittany was deteriorating rapidly. The female FBI agent had her securely pinned, refusing to let the struggling heiress break free. Brittany was screaming so loudly that her voice was beginning to give out, turning into a harsh, grating rasp. She thrashed her shoulders, twisting wildly in her pristine white designer dress, but the federal agent did not even flinch. The agent calmly began to read Brittany, her Miranda rights, her clear authoritative voice slicing right through the hysterical shrieks. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited, stating the words with practiced precision. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Brittany shook her head violently, sending her perfectly styled blonde hair flying across her tear-soaked face. "I am not listening to you," she screamed, her voice cracking. "My father is going to fix this. My father is going to have you all fired. You cannot arrest me for real estate transactions. I am a Caldwell." The agent continued reading the rights, completely ignoring the temper tantrum. "You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Brittany let out a loud, bitter laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. "Afford an attorney?" she shrieked. "We have more money than God. My father has the best lawyers in the state on retainer. When he finds out what you are doing, he is going to destroy you." She was clinging to the illusion of her family wealth like a life preserver in the middle of a hurricane. She did not understand that the federal government had already frozen every single offshore account, every hidden trust fund, and every shell company her father had ever created. The money she was bragging about was currently sitting in a locked federal holding account, inaccessible and useless. The agent finished reading the rights and firmly guided Brittany toward the center aisle. Brittany dug her expensive heels into the marble floor, trying to resist the forward momentum, but she was easily overpowered. Right next to her, the reality of the situation was finally crashing down onto my older brother. Isaiah had stopped sobbing long enough to actually listen to the charges the federal agents were reading to him. They were not arresting him just for being married to Brittany. They were arresting him for being the primary signatory on the massive money laundering operation. "Isaiah Thorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit interstate wire fraud and corporate racketeering," the agent stated, holding Isaiah up by his arms. Isaiah blinked, his red, swollen eyes widening as the specific legal terminology hit his ears. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "I am not a racketeer. I just signed some development papers. Brittany told me to sign them so I could be the chief executive officer of the resort project. She said it was just a formality." The FBI agent looked at my brother with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Signing your name as the chief executive officer of 14 different fraudulent shell companies is not a formality, Mr. Thorne," the agent explained coldly. "It makes you the primary conspirator in a federal money laundering syndicate. You signed the documents authorizing the transfer of illicit funds. That makes you legally responsible for the entire operation." The blood completely rushed out of Isaiah's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. The full catastrophic weight of his own stupidity had finally landed squarely on his chest. He had been so desperate to play the part of a wealthy, successful businessman, so desperate to impress our parents and keep up with his rich white wife, that he had blindly signed every single document she placed in front of him. He thought he was getting a corner office and a luxury company car. He did not realize he was literally signing his own federal prison sentence. "Brittany set me up!" Isaiah wailed, his voice echoing with pure, pathetic desperation. He turned his head, trying to look at his wife, who was being dragged down the aisle ahead of him. "Brittany, tell them," he screamed, crying openly now. "Tell them I did not know where the money came from. Tell them you just needed a minority business owner on paper to get the tax breaks." Brittany did not even look back at him. She was too busy screaming at the agents about her ruined designer dress and threatening them with lawsuits. She had completely discarded him the moment she realized she was going down. He was no longer her convenient, diverse husband. He was just another piece of collateral damage. Isaiah looked back at me, his chest heaving with deep, panicking sobs. "Tamara, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "You know I'm not smart enough to run a money laundering ring. You know I just do what people tell me to do. Please, Tamara, tell them I am innocent. Tell them I am just an idiot." I stood at the defense table, my posture straight and unyielding. I looked at the golden child of the Thorne family, the man who had spent his entire life looking down on me for choosing public service over corporate greed. "You are an idiot, Isaiah," I replied, my voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "But being an idiot does not grant you immunity from federal law. You wanted to be a big-shot resort developer. You wanted to pave over Grandpa's legacy so you could brag at the country club. Now you get to face the consequences of being the CEO you always pretended to be." The agent stepped forward and began to march him away. He dragged his feet, crying out for our parents, crying out for me, completely stripped of the unearned arrogance that had defined his entire existence. In the gallery directly behind the path of the federal agents, Julian and Brenda Thorne were watching their entire world collapse into absolute ruin. They had spent decades carefully constructing an image of upper-middle-class perfection. They had tailored every aspect of their lives to project wealth status and unbothered superiority. They had proudly paraded Isaiah around to all their friends, boasting about his brilliant marriage into the Caldwell real estate empire. They had actively and maliciously participated in the emotional destruction of their only daughter, simply because my military service and straightforward honesty did not fit into their shallow, pretentious narrative. They had literally sat in this very courtroom just an hour ago, smiling and nodding, while a corrupt judge tried to steal my inheritance and strip me of my military honors. Now they were pressed back against the hard wooden pews, unable to move, unable to speak, completely paralyzed by the federal nightmare unfolding right in front of their eyes. My mother had her hands clamped tightly over her mouth, tears streaming silently down her carefully powdered cheeks. Her chest hitched with suppressed sobs as she watched her wealthy, beautiful daughter-in-law being dragged away in steel handcuffs, screaming obscenities like a common criminal. The pristine image of the Caldwell family, the dynasty my mother had worshipped and bowed down to, was being exposed as a dirty criminal enterprise right before her eyes. Every country club lunch, every bragging conversation, every moment of smug superiority she had felt by association was turning to toxic ash in her mouth. My father looked even worse. Julian Thorne was a man who cared about respect and hierarchy above all else. He had looked at me with absolute disgust when I refused to simply hand over the 50-acre estate. He had called me a disgrace to the family. Now he was forced to watch as heavy-armed federal agents marched his golden boy down the center aisle of the courthouse. He watched Isaiah sobbing and begging, sniveling and shifting the blame, proving once and for all that he possessed absolutely zero character or integrity. My father saw the federal agents treating his son not as a respected businessman, but as a pathetic white-collar criminal. The realization that his entire legacy, the son he had poured all his love and financial support into, was heading to a federal penitentiary seemed to physically crush him. His shoulders were completely slumped, his hands gripping the wooden pew in front of him so tightly his knuckles were white. They were losing everything in the span of 5 minutes. The rich daughter-in-law was gone. The powerful political connections were gone. The golden child was gone. The 50-acre luxury resort that was supposed to secure their high society status was completely erased from existence. They had bet all their chips on the corrupt power of the Caldwell family, and they had lost with spectacular absolute finality. They had alienated the only person in their family who actually had real power, real honor, and real integrity. They looked at me standing calmly at the defense table, the Navy cross shining on my lapel, and the federal badge tucked safely in my pocket, and they finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of their miscalculation. As Isaiah was marched past their row, he reached out his cuffed hands toward them. "Mom, Dad, help me!" He sobbed, his face wet with tears and sweat. "Call a lawyer. Please do not let them take me." My mother let out a loud, agonizing wail, breaking her silent shock. She lunged forward, reaching over the wooden barrier, trying to grab the sleeve of Isaiah's suit jacket. "Isaiah, my baby!" she cried out, her voice echoing through the clearing courtroom. "Please stop! You cannot take him. He is a good boy." He did not do anything. The federal agents smoothly but firmly blocked her path, keeping a solid wall between the prisoner and the frantic mother. "Mom, step back." The agent commanded, his voice projecting absolute zero tolerance for interference. "Do not interfere with a federal transport. Step back right now." My father grabbed my mother's waist and pulled her back into the pew, wrapping his arms around her as she collapsed against his chest. He buried his face in her shoulder, squeezing his eyes shut, unable to watch his son be led out the heavy oak doors. The heavy thud of the doors closing behind the agents sounded like the final definitive end of the Thorne family illusion. The courtroom was suddenly incredibly quiet. The local bailiffs and clerks were standing in stunned silence, unsure of what to do now that their corrupt judge had been hauled away. The air in the room felt different, lighter somehow, as if a massive toxic cloud had just been vacuumed out of the building. David stepped forward and stood right next to me, his presence a warm, solid wall of support. He looked at the empty aisle where the criminals had just been paraded, and then he looked at the two broken, weeping people still sitting in the gallery. They had absolutely nothing left. Their social climbing had led them straight to the bottom of a federal crater. They had traded their morals, their daughter and their grandfather's legacy, for a handful of dirty money and a fake smile from a criminal heiress. Now, they were going to have to go back to their empty house, face their country club friends, and explain why their son was on the evening news in federal handcuffs. The immediate fallout was absolute total devastation, and they had brought every single ounce of it upon themselves. I watched them cry, and I felt no urge to comfort them. The federal trap was fully closed, and the predators had finally become the prey. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind us with a loud, echoing thud, sealing away the toxic chapter of my life forever. The vast marble hallway stretched out before David and me, a long corridor leading toward the main exit and the clean, fresh air of the city. I took a deep breath, feeling the intense adrenaline of the federal raid slowly beginning to ebb from my bloodstream. The mission was accomplished. The criminals were in custody, and my grandfather's legacy was permanently secured. But the fragile peace of the moment was immediately shattered by the frantic sound of footsteps scrambling across the polished stone floor behind us. My parents had chased us out of the courtroom, unable to accept the absolute finality of the boundary I had just drawn. Julian and Brenda Thorne threw themselves directly into our path, physically blocking the wide corridor and cutting off our exit. My mother was completely unrecognizable from the pristine society woman who had walked into the courthouse that morning. Her expensive pastel suit was wrinkled and damp with nervous sweat. Her meticulously styled hair was falling around her face in erratic, messy strands. She threw herself forward, closing the distance between us, and grabbed the fabric of my charcoal suit jacket with trembling, desperate hands. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as she unleashed a torrent of hysterical sobbing. "Tamara, please, you have to listen to me," she wailed, her voice bouncing sharply off the high ceilings of the courthouse hallway. "You are a federal agent. You have clearance. You have the power to stop this. You have to go back in there and get your brother out." He did not know what he was doing. Brittany manipulated him. He is just a victim in all of this. "Please, Tamara, we are family. You cannot let them take your own brother to federal prison. We are a family." She pulled at my jacket, her knees buckling slightly, as if she were about to collapse right onto the hard marble floor. My father stood right behind her, his face completely pale, his eyes wide with a pathetic, pleading desperation. He did not have the strength to speak, but his silence was just as loud as my mother's screaming. They were begging the daughter they had repeatedly discarded to save the golden child who had ultimately destroyed them. They were playing the family card, a card they had happily burned to ashes when they thought Brittany and her corrupt judge were going to hand them a luxury resort. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I simply looked down at my mother's frantic hands clutching my lapel. I reached up with slow, deliberate precision and firmly grasped her wrists. I peeled her fingers off my jacket one by one, ignoring her desperate whimpering. I pushed her hands away from me, establishing a physical boundary that matched the emotional wall I had permanently built around my heart. I raised my right hand to my chest where the bronze navy cross rested securely against the dark fabric. I slowly ran my thumb over the textured surface of the metal, ensuring it was perfectly pinned perfectly straight. The cool metal was a grounding force, reminding me of the oath I had taken to protect my country from domestic and foreign threats. The people standing in front of me were no longer my parents. They were domestic threats to my peace, my legacy, and my grandfather's memory. I looked at my mother and father with absolute chilling indifference. There was no anger left in my eyes. There was no sadness. There was only the cold, vast emptiness of a completely severed bond. When you sat in that courtroom and watched a corrupt judge strip this metal from my chest, you stopped being my family. I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any human warmth. You sat there in silence while a man you bribed tried to humiliate my military service. You smiled while my sister-in-law tried to steal the land your own father bled for. You chose your side and you chose to align yourselves with criminals because you wanted to pretend you belonged in a country club. My mother let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with her hands, as the absolute zero temperature of my words froze the blood in her veins. My father closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and sliding down his wrinkled cheek. The law does not make exceptions for enablers. I continued staring right through them. The law does not care that Isaiah is your golden child. He signed his name to a massive federal money laundering syndicate. He wanted the title, he wanted the money, and now he gets the consequences. Save your tears for the visitation room. Isaiah is going to federal prison, and there is absolutely nothing you or I or anyone else can do to stop it. I held my gaze on them for 2 more seconds, ensuring the absolute finality of my statement was permanently burned into their memories. They had nothing left to say. Their illusions were shattered, their social standing was annihilated, and their precious son was currently being fingerprinted by the FBI. David stepped forward, moving from his protective stance behind me to stand directly at my side. He did not say a word to my parents. He simply reached out and took my hand, interlocking his fingers with mine. The warmth and strength of his grip was the perfect counterweight to the cold reality of what I had just done. He squeezed my hand firmly, sending a silent message of absolute support and unwavering love. We turned our backs on Julian and Brenda Thorne. We did not look back as we walked down the long marble corridor, leaving the sounds of my mother's hopeless sobbing echoing against the cold stone walls. We pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse entrance and stepped out into the city. The rain had completely stopped, and the heavy gray clouds were parting to reveal a brilliant, clear blue sky. The air smelled fresh and clean, washing away the stale, toxic atmosphere of the courtroom and the people inside it. The drive away from the downtown district felt like floating. I sat in the passenger seat watching the city buildings blur past my window, feeling an immense, profound weight lifting off my shoulders. For my entire life, I had carried the burden of trying to earn the respect of a family that was fundamentally incapable of giving it. I had joined the military, I had served my country, I had built a highly successful career in federal law enforcement, and none of it had ever been enough for them, because I was not Isaiah. Now, I finally understood that their approval was never something worth striving for. Their approval was toxic. Their love was conditional and heavily mortgaged against their own selfish ambitions. Severing that tie was not a loss. It was an absolute liberation. We did not drive to our house in the city. David knew exactly where we needed to go without me having to say a single word. He steered the car toward the highway, heading out of the concrete grid and into the lush green countryside. The transition from the noisy, bustling streets to the quiet, serene roads leading toward the lakefront was a physical manifestation of the peace I was finally claiming for myself. An hour later, the familiar rusted iron gates of the Thorne estate came into view. David pulled the car to a stop and I got out to manually push the heavy gates open. They creaked on their hinges, a stubborn, enduring sound that I had loved since I was a little girl. We drove down the long, winding gravel driveway flanked by towering ancient oak trees that my grandfather had planted with his own two hands. The dense canopy of green leaves filtered the late afternoon sunlight, casting beautiful golden patterns across the dirt road. David parked the car near the old wooden farmhouse. We stepped out and walked around the side of the building, heading toward the vast open expanse of the backyard. The 50 acres of property stretched out before us, an untouched sanctuary of rolling green hills, dense clusters of pine trees, and the sparkling, pristine waters of the lake in the distance. This was the land that Brittany had looked at and seen nothing but a site for a concrete parking lot and a pretentious golf course. This was the land my brother wanted to pave over to satisfy his own shallow greed. I walked up the steps of the wraparound wooden porch and leaned against the sturdy railing. David came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood there together in perfect, comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. The sky was transforming into a breathtaking canvas of deep orange, brilliant pink, and soft purple. The reflection of the sunset danced across the surface of the lake, creating a million tiny points of shimmering light. I thought about the federal holding cells located in the basement of the downtown courthouse. I thought about Judge Harrison Atwood sitting on a metal bench stripped of his black robe and his corrupt authority, facing the total destruction of his legacy and a guaranteed decade in a federal penitentiary. I thought about Brittany Caldwell, Thorne trading her designer white dress for a bright orange jumpsuit, screaming at public defenders who would never be able to save her from the overwhelming mountain of financial evidence I had compiled against her. I thought about her father, the untouchable real estate kingpin, watching his entire empire be seized and liquidated by the United States government. And I thought about Isaiah, my older brother who had spent 38 years coasting on the unearned adoration of our parents. He was currently sitting in a concrete cell, realizing that his rich wife had used him as a human shield. He was going to have a lot of time to think about his choices over the next 10 to 15 years of his federal sentence. Our parents would spend the rest of their lives visiting him through thick plexiglass, trying to pretend they still possessed some semblance of dignity, while living in the absolute ruin of their social climbing dreams. The federal takedown was absolute. There would be no plea deals that saved them from prison time. The evidence was too concrete, the money laundering too extensive, and the corruption of a sitting judge too egregious for the Department of Justice to show any mercy. They had lost everything: their wealth, their freedom, their reputation, and their family. They were going to rot in federal custody, completely forgotten by the high society circles they had sacrificed everything to join. A soft, cool breeze blew off the lake, rustling the leaves of the oak trees and bringing the scent of pine and fresh earth up to the porch. I reached up and placed my hand over David's, resting my fingers against his. My chest felt incredibly light. The anger and the betrayal that had fueled me for the past month had completely burned away, leaving only a profound, solid peace. The Thorne estate was safe. The Federal Conservation Trust guaranteed that no developer, no corrupt politician, and no greedy relative could ever touch a single blade of grass on these 50 acres. The land would remain wild and free, a permanent living monument to a man who had worked his hands to the bone to secure a piece of the American dream for his descendants. My grandfather had trusted me to protect his legacy because he knew the strength of my character. He knew I possessed the discipline, the courage, and the unyielding moral compass required to stand against the insidious rot of human greed. I looked out at the vibrant sunset painting the sky over the water. The beauty of the estate was overwhelming, a quiet, resilient testament to the endurance of truth and honor. The shadows of the trees lengthened across the grass as the day finally gave way to dusk. The storm had passed, the enemies were vanquished, and the future was entirely ours to write. I leaned back against my husband, listening to the steady, calming rhythm of his breathing. The war was over, the land was secure, and the legacy of the Thorne family was finally at absolute perfect peace. The greatest lesson from this story is that true family is defined by respect and loyalty, not just blood. When people show you their true colors and choose greed over love, you have to believe them. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary step for your own survival and peace. Integrity cannot be bought, and honor cannot be stripped away by corrupt individuals. Sometimes the hardest battles we face are against those closest to us, but standing your ground and protecting your legacy will always bring the ultimate justice and absolute liberation you truly deserve. If you have ever had to set difficult boundaries with toxic family members to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below.